The cowboy threw himself into the burning barn without hesitation, and the woman he barely touched suddenly realized who he'd been trying to save all along. Flames roared through the rafters as snow whipped across Savannah's face. A horse screamed somewhere inside the smoke. Then she saw Rhett disappear into the fire, with nothing but a wet blanket over his shoulders, and her little brother still trapped inside. The barn groaned once, and part of the roof began to fall. If stories that stay with you matter, come ride along with this one. The train screamed against the frozen tracks before it finally groaned to a stop beside the cold Mercy Depot. Steam rolled across the platform in thick white clouds. Snow blew sideways through the mountain pass, sharp enough to sting the eyes. A lantern hanging beside the station office swung in the wind with a dull metal creak. Savannah Turner stepped down carefully, one gloved hand gripping the rail. Her boots touched frozen mud. For a moment she simply stood there. The Colorado wind cut through her wool coat and slipped beneath her collar like icy fingers. Around her, passengers hurried away, with lowered heads, dragging trunks through the slush. Nobody waited for her. She carried one old brown suitcase with a cracked leather handle. Tucked inside her coat pocket sat a folded bank, notice stamped, past due in red ink, and a small photograph of her younger brother, Elijah, standing outside a church mission house in Kansas City, smiling too hard for the camera. A horse snorted nearby. Two men unloading flour barrels slowed long enough to stare. One of them muttered quietly, "That her?" The other nodded toward the North Hills. Poor woman. Savannah kept walking. The depot smelled like coal smoke and wet wool. Across the street, Cold Mercy stretched beneath the gray morning sky. False front buildings, muddy wagon ruts buried beneath snow. A blacksmith shop coughing sparks into the wind. Above everything rose the mountains, dark and heavy like sleeping giants. Near the bakery window, an older woman, wrapped in a thick shawl, watched Savannah pass. "You headed to Broken Ridge?" she asked softly. Savannah stopped. The woman's eyes drifted toward the folded letter in Savannah's hand. She must have recognized the name written there. Rhett Maddox. Savannah gave a small nod. The woman lowered her gaze for a second before saying quietly, "No woman stays with Rhett through winter." The wind rattled the shop windows. Savannah slipped the letter back into her pocket. "I'm not looking for forever," she answered. The woman looked like she wanted to say something else. Instead, she stepped back into the bakery, the bell above the door giving one lonely jingle. Snowflakes gathered along Savannah's lashes as she crossed the street toward the land office. Inside, the room was warm from a pot-belly stove glowing orange in the corner. A clerk dipped his pen into ink without looking up. Beside the window stood a tall man in a dark coat dusted with snow. Rhett Maddox. He did not step forward, did not smile. His broad shoulders nearly blocked the pale light coming through the glass. A black hat shadowed most of his face. But Savannah could still see the rough line of his jaw and the silver scar near his throat disappearing beneath his collar. He looked older than 35, not in years, in wear. The clerk cleared his throat awkwardly. "Miss Turner?" Savannah removed her gloves slowly, fingers stiff from cold. The papers were already waiting. No flowers sat on the desk, no Bible, no preacher, only ink, signatures, a government seal. Rhett signed first. His handwriting was blunt and heavy. Savannah signed after him. The clerk mumbled the legal words like he was reading a receipt. When it was over, silence settled back into the room. Rhett finally looked at her directly. His eyes were gray, winter gray. "You'll have a roof," he said. "That's all I can promise. Not welcome, not kindness, just truth." Savannah studied him for a moment, then nodded once. "A roof's more than I had yesterday." Something shifted in his expression, then disappeared just as quickly. Outside, the wind had grown stronger. Rhett loaded her suitcase into the back of a narrow wagon. Snow dusted the shoulders of his coat while he tightened the leather straps with slow, practiced movements. A rifle rested beside the wagon seat, clean and polished despite the weather. Savannah noticed it immediately. He noticed her noticing. "Coyotes," he said simply. She climbed into the wagon without asking anything else. The horses pulled them north out of cold mercy while daylight faded behind thick storm clouds. The road narrowed as they climbed higher into the mountains. Pine trees crowded close on both sides, black against the snow. The wagon wheels cracked through frozen ruts. Rhett barely spoke. Once he asked if she was cold. Another time he pointed toward a steep ridge ahead. "Road gets bad there." That was all. Savannah folded her gloved hands tightly in her lap and watched the wilderness pass by. Somewhere beneath the wagon blanket, her fingers touched Elijah's photograph again. She wondered if she had made the worst mistake of her life. Hours later, the ranch finally appeared through the snowfall. Broken Ridge sat alone beneath the mountains, surrounded by leaning fences and dark pine woods. Smoke drifted from the chimney in a thin, crooked line. The house itself was larger than she expected, but lonely. The kind of lonely that settled into the wood. Rhett climbed down first and tied the horses beside the hitching rail. Snow creaked beneath his boots. Savannah stepped carefully from the wagon. That was when she saw it. A small wooden child's chair sitting near the front porch, half buried in snow. Tiny enough for a little girl. One of its legs had been repaired by hand. A faded blue ribbon still hung from the backrest, stiff with winter frost. Savannah stared at it. No children's voices came from the house. No footsteps, no laughter. Only wind moving through the trees. Behind her, Rhett went completely still. For the first time since she met him, something crossed his face too fast to name. Pain. He turned away immediately and grabbed her suitcase before she could say a word. "Storm's coming harder," he muttered. Then he walked toward the house without looking back. Savannah remained there 1 second longer, snow gathering across the shoulders of her coat, staring at the little chair beside the empty porch. And somewhere deep inside the silence of Broken Ridge Ranch, she felt the shape of a grief waiting for her. The front door opened with a dry groan. Warm lamplight spilled across the snow. Rhett stood inside holding her suitcase in one hand. "Storm'll freeze the hinges shut if you stay out there." Savannah stepped onto the porch without answering. As she passed the small chair, she noticed tiny scratches carved into the wood near the seat. Not random marks, letters, a child practicing her name, E.L. The rest had been worn away by weather. Inside, the house smelled of cedar smoke, old coffee, and cold iron. A lantern flickered above the table. Its glass chimney had been cracked and repaired with wire. Near the stove sat a pair of muddy boots drying beside a coffee pot, blackened from years over fire. Nothing in the room looked new. Nothing looked touched by a woman in a very long time. Rhett placed her suitcase near the staircase. Rooms upstairs. End of the hall. Savannah glanced toward the second floor. One door stood closed with a brass lock fixed across it. The hallway around it stayed dark. "You hungry?" Rhett asked. The question sounded awkward coming from him, like something he wasn't used to offering. "A little." He nodded once and moved toward the stove. Dinner was venison stew reheated from yesterday. Thick carrots floated near the surface beside onions and chunks of potato cooked soft from hours over low heat. Rhett filled her bowl first, before taking his own seat across from her. Outside, wind rattled the windows. Inside, only spoons against tin bowls broke the silence. Savannah noticed something after a few minutes. The larger piece of meat sat in her bowl. Rhett's own portion barely held any. He ate without looking up. That strange ache returned to her chest again. Not pity exactly, something quieter. After supper, Rhett rose first. "There's hot water in the kettle if you need it." Then he reached for his coat again. "You're going back outside?" Savannah asked before she could stop herself. "Barn. In this weather?" He paused near the door. Snow hissed against the windows behind him. Horses don't stop needing fed because it's cold. Then he stepped into the storm. Savannah remained by the fire long after the door shut. The house creaked around her. Above the stove hung a faded dish towel stitched with blue flowers. One corner had burned dark brown. Beside the sink sat a child's metal cup no bigger than her hand. She touched it lightly, cold, unused. Later, upstairs, she unpacked slowly beneath the weak glow of an oil lamp. 2 dresses, a comb missing teeth, Elijah's photograph, the folded bank notice. The room itself surprised her. Clean, not fancy, but cared for. A quilt lay folded neatly at the foot of the bed. Fresh pine branches had been tucked near the window frame to keep mice away from the walls. Small things, careful things. Things a man wouldn't think to do unless he'd spent time preparing for someone to come. Savannah sat on the edge of the mattress and listened. At first, she heard only wind. Then, faintly from outside, came the steady sound of hammering. She crossed to the window. Below, near the barn lantern, Rhett stood splitting wood in the snow. Not hurried, not angry, just working beneath the storm, like a man who didn't know how to stop. The next morning came gray and bitter cold. Savannah woke early and found fresh logs already stacked beside the kitchen stove. No snow on them, meaning he'd brought them in before dawn. She cooked biscuits anyway, burned the first batch. The second came out better. Rhett entered quietly while she stood brushing flour from her hands. Snow clung to his shoulders. His beard carried tiny crystals of ice. He stopped when he smelled breakfast. Savannah slid a plate toward him. Figured a roof wasn't the only thing 2 married people needed. For a second, she thought she saw the corner of his mouth almost move. Almost, he sat down slowly. Outside, morning light spread pale over Broken Ridge. The wind had calmed enough for smoke to rise straight from the chimney. Rhett ate 1 biscuit in silence, then another. Savannah hid a small smile behind her coffee cup. By afternoon, she had opened the front curtains halfway. Dust drifted through the sunlight. The house looked less like a grave. She was shaking rugs outside when a wagon rattled up near the gate. A woman stepped down wearing a dark green coat trimmed with fur at the collar. Older, sharp-eyed. She carried a flat hat box under one arm. "You must be the new Mrs. Maddox," she said. Savannah straightened carefully. "I suppose I am." The woman glanced toward the barn where Rhett worked beside the fence line. "Well," she murmured, "that alone's enough to make Cold Mercy gossip through spring." Savannah almost laughed. The woman extended a gloved hand. "Clara Whitmore. I own the seam shop in town." Her handshake felt warm despite the cold air. "I brought you thread," Clara said, lifting the box slightly. No woman survives mountain winter without good thread. Inside the hat box sat sewing needles, dark blue fabric, and 2 cinnamon rolls wrapped in cloth. Savannah looked up, surprised. Clara shrugged lightly. "Town's easier when at least one person acts human." From outside came the sharp crack of splitting timber. Clara's eyes drifted toward the sound. "He wasn't always like this," she said quietly. Savannah followed her gaze. Rhett stood alone in the snow beyond the fence, shoulders bent slightly against the cold. "What happened to him?" Savannah asked. Clara hesitated too long. Then she said softly, "Fire, nothing more." That night Savannah woke sometime after midnight. The wind had died completely. Moonlight silvered the snow outside her window. She noticed another light moving near the barn. Pulling on her coat, she stepped quietly downstairs. The porch boards creaked beneath her boots. Near the open barn door sat Rhett on an overturned bucket, elbows resting on his knees. In his hands lay a small child's scarf, blue wool, thin from years of use. He stared at it without moving. Savannah watched from the shadows. For the first time since coming to Broken Ridge Ranch, Rhett Maddox did not look dangerous. He looked alone, and somehow that was worse. Savannah stayed hidden beside the porch rail, while snow drifted softly through the barn light. Rhett never noticed her there. He sat with the little blue scarf hanging from his rough hands, staring at the stable floor, as if he were listening to voices nobody else could hear. The lantern beside him flickered every time the wind slipped through the loose boards. After a long while, he folded the scarf carefully and tucked it inside his coat pocket. Not thrown aside, not forgotten, kept close. Savannah went back upstairs before he returned to the house. She lay awake for hours afterward, listening to his boots cross the porch below. The next few days settled into a strange rhythm. Cold mornings, smoke from the chimney, Rhett working from sunrise until dark, Savannah cleaning rooms no one had touched in years. She found old horseshoes stacked beside the kitchen door, receipts from a feed store in Denver folded inside a drawer, a cracked child's marble beneath the staircase. Broken Ridge Ranch felt less like a home and more like a place someone had abandoned halfway through living. One afternoon, Savannah rode into Cold Mercy with Clara Whitmore to buy lamp oil and flour. The town streets had turned to gray slush beneath wagon wheels. Men in heavy coats crowded outside the saloon with cigars burning against the cold air. Savannah stepped inside Mercer General Store, while Clara visited the post office. The warmth hit her first, then the silence. 3 men near the stove stopped talking when she entered. One of them smirked over his coffee cup. "Looks like the devil finally found himself a bride." Another chuckled. "Wonder how long she lasts up there." Savannah kept walking toward the shelves. Her fingers tightened around the flour sack. Behind her boots scraped across the wooden floor. "You oughta know," the first man continued lazily. "Folks disappear around Broken Ridge." The room gave a nervous little laugh. Savannah turned slowly. "Then it's strange you're still here talking." That wiped the smile from his face. But before another word could leave his mouth, the front door opened hard against the wind. Rhett stepped inside. Snow dusted his shoulders. Cold air followed him through the doorway. The whole store changed. Nobody moved. Nobody smiled. Rhett looked once at the man near the stove. Not angry, not loud, just steady. The man dropped his eyes first. Rhett crossed the room, lifted the flour sack from Savannah's hands, and nodded toward the door. "Road's getting worse." Nothing else, but he walked beside her all the way back to the wagon. That night, the storm came down from the mountains fast. Wind screamed across Broken Ridge, hard enough to shake the windows. Snow piled against the porch steps by midnight. Savannah woke near dawn to silence. Too much silence. No wind, no horses. Then somewhere outside came a sharp cracking sound. Ice. She threw on her coat and grabbed the water buckets before thinking twice. The creek behind the lower pasture would freeze solid by morning if she waited longer. Snow reached nearly to her knees as she crossed the yard. The mountains looked pale blue beneath the early light. At the creek bank, she knelt carefully, breaking thin ice along the edge with the handle of the bucket. Water rushed black beneath it. Then her boot slipped. 1 second, that was all. The bank gave way beneath fresh snow, and Savannah slid hard toward the creek. Ice cracked loudly under her weight. Freezing water surged around one leg as she clawed desperately at the rocks. The current pulled hard. Sharp panic shot through her chest. Rhett. The name tore from her throat before she even realized it. Then came the thunder of hooves. Rhett appeared over the ridge, riding hard through the snow. He jumped from the saddle before the horse fully stopped. "Don't move." Ice snapped again beneath Savannah's hands. Rhett dropped flat onto the bank and threw down a leather rein toward her. "Grab it." The water had numbed her fingers already. She missed once. The second time she caught it. Rhett braced both boots deep into the snow and pulled with everything he had. The ice shattered wider. For one awful second, Savannah disappeared waist-deep into the freezing creek. Then Rhett dragged her free onto solid ground. Both of them collapsed hard into the snow. Savannah gasped against the cold while Rhett held onto her arm like he thought the mountain itself might try taking her back. Blood ran down one of his hands. The jagged rocks near the creek had torn the skin open while he pulled her out. Neither of them spoke. Their breath hung white between them. Finally, Rhett looked at her soaked skirt, then at the dark water rushing below. His jaw tightened. "You could have died." It was the first time she had heard real fear in his voice. Back at the ranch, he forced more wood into the stove until heat rolled through the kitchen walls. Savannah sat wrapped in blankets near the fire while Rhett cleaned blood from his torn hand at the sink. The cut was deep across his palm. "Sit down," Savannah said quietly. "I'm fine. You're bleeding on the floor." He looked down. A few drops of red stained the old wooden boards beneath him. After a long moment, he finally sat at the kitchen table. Savannah fetched the sewing needle from her mending basket and held it carefully above the lantern flame. Rhett watched her silently. "You know how to do this?" he asked. "My husband worked rail camps," she answered softly. "Men got hurt." The room grew still again after that. Savannah stitched his hand beneath the yellow glow of the oil lamp while snow drifted against the windows outside. Rhett barely flinched. But once, when the needle pulled through the deepest part of the cut, his fingers tightened suddenly around the edge of the table. Savannah looked up. His eyes were fixed somewhere far beyond the kitchen walls. "She was 7, he said quietly. Savannah stopped moving. Rhett swallowed once before continuing. "My little girl." The fire cracked softly behind them. "She liked blue ribbons," he murmured. "Would tie 'em on anything she could reach." Savannah thought immediately of the chair on the porch, the scarf, the locked room upstairs. Rhett stared down at his wounded hand. The barn caught fire during a storm same as this one. His voice sounded flat now, worn thin from carrying the memory too long. "Roof beam came down before I could get to him." Savannah said nothing. Outside, snow whispered across the roof. "Town said I was drunk," he continued. "Said I started it myself. But you didn't." Rhett's eyes lifted slowly toward hers. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then very quietly he said, "No." Something heavy moved through the silence after that. Not gone, just finally spoken aloud. Much later that night, Savannah woke thirsty and went downstairs for water. A faint lantern glow spilled through the barn door again. She stepped closer carefully. Inside, Rhett stood alone beside a workbench. Wood shavings covered the floor around his boots. In his hands rested the curved side of a small cradle. Savannah froze in the barn doorway. The lantern hanging above Rhett cast long shadows across the unfinished wood. Pine shavings clung to his sleeves and gathered around the legs of the workbench like pale curls of snow. He looked up slowly. For a second, neither of them spoke. Then Rhett set the cradle piece down almost carefully. Like a man caught holding something fragile, he never meant another soul to see. "You should be inside," he said quietly. Savannah's eyes stayed on the cradle. The smooth runners, the sanded edges, the tiny carved stars worked into the side panel with rough, patient hands. "It's beautiful," she whispered. Rhett's jaw tightened. "It ain't finished." He reached for a cloth and covered part of it, though not before Savannah noticed a folded strip of faded blue ribbon resting beside the tools. The same color as the scarf. The same color as the ribbon on the little chair outside. Snow hissed softly against the barn roof. Savannah stepped farther inside. Who was she? Rhett stood very still. The horses shifted quietly in their stalls nearby. Leather tack creaked from its hooks along the wall. Finally, he answered. "Emily." The name settled into the cold barn air. "My daughter." Savannah nodded once. Nothing more. She understood enough now to know. Grief did not like too many questions. The next morning, the storm finally cleared from the mountains. Sunlight spilled bright across Broken Ridge for the first time in days. Ice dripped steadily from the porch roof. Somewhere in the distance came the lonely whistle of a freight train winding through the pass toward Denver. Savannah opened the curtains wider that day. All of them. Dust swirled golden in the sunlight. Rhett noticed immediately when he walked in carrying fresh-cut wood. His eyes moved toward the windows first, then toward her. "You changed the house," he muttered. "It needed daylight." He looked around the room quietly. For the first time since arriving, Savannah saw him stand inside the kitchen, without seeming eager to leave it. That afternoon she found an old phonograph tucked beneath blankets in the upstairs hallway closet. The brass horn had dulled green with age, but after cleaning the needle and winding the crank, music crackled softly into the room. A slow piano tune, thin and distant. Rhett stopped dead in the doorway downstairs when he heard it. Savannah thought maybe she'd made a mistake. But instead of anger, something else crossed his face. Memory. He removed his gloves slowly. "She used to dance to that one," he said. Savannah turned toward him carefully. "Emily?" A faint nod. The record spun on with its soft, worn melody. Rhett stood listening longer than he probably intended before stepping quietly outside again. Still, he did not ask her to turn it off. The days after that changed in small ways. Not loudly, not suddenly, just enough to notice. Rhett stopped eating alone in the barn. He stayed at the kitchen table after supper, while Savannah mended clothes near the stove. Sometimes he sharpened tools while she read from an old newspaper Clara had given her from town. Once, while crossing the icy yard, Savannah nearly slipped carrying laundry. Rhett caught her elbow before she fell. His hand stayed there half a second too long. Neither mentioned it afterward. Another evening he saddled his best horse, a tall chestnut gelding named Copper, and handed Savannah the reins without explanation. She stared at him. "You trust me with this one?" "He trusts you already," Rhett answered. That mattered more somehow. By late February, tiny green shoots had begun pushing through the snow near the south fence line. Then Calvin Boone came to Broken Ridge. Savannah saw the rider first from the kitchen window. Expensive coat, silver watch chain, too polished for ranch country. Rhett saw him too, and immediately went still. Calvin Boone dismounted with the easy smile of a man used to getting what he wanted. "Well now," he called toward the porch. Didn't expect Broken Ridge to look alive again. Rhett remained leaning against the rail, arms folded. "What do you want, Calvin?" "No welcome for an old neighbor." "You ain't my neighbor." Calvin's smile thinned slightly. His eyes drifted toward Savannah standing inside near the window. "So this is the new wife." Savannah disliked him instantly, not because of his words, because of the way Rhett watched him. Like a man watching a snake near livestock, Calvin removed his gloves slowly. "Mine inspectors found silver running under the North Ridge last month." He glanced toward the mountains. "You're sitting on valuable land. Not selling. You should reconsider." Rhett's voice hardened. "You done talking?" For a moment the wind moved between them. Then Calvin smiled again, though it never reached his eyes. "Storms have a way of taking things from you up here, Rhett." He climbed back onto his horse. "Would hate seeing that happen twice." Savannah felt the change in the air immediately after he rode away. Rhett didn't move for a long time. That night he checked every lantern in the barn twice. Before bed, Savannah found him standing outside near the fence line with the shotgun resting against his shoulder. "You think he'll come back?" she asked softly. Rhett looked toward the dark mountain ridge beyond the ranch. He never really left. 3 days later, Elijah arrived. The church wagon from Carson Creek dropped him at the gate just before sunset. He was taller than Savannah remembered, thin from winter, coat sleeves too short at the wrists, but smiling. "Sis," Savannah ran through the snow before the wagon fully stopped. Elijah hugged her hard enough to nearly lift her off the ground. Rhett stood back near the porch watching quietly. Elijah looked nervous the moment he noticed him. "You're Mr. Maddox." "Rhett's fine." Elijah nodded awkwardly. That evening, Savannah laughed more than she had since coming west. The sound filled the kitchen while Elijah talked about the mission school and the old preacher who snored during Sunday service. Rhett barely spoke. Still, Savannah noticed him sliding the larger piece of cornbread toward Elijah's plate when the boy thought nobody was looking. Outside, snow began falling again, heavy, silent. Near midnight, Savannah woke to the smell of smoke. Not fireplace smoke, something sharper. Burning hay. Then came shouting. Elijah! Savannah bolted upright. Orange light flashed across the bedroom walls. She ran to the window. The barn was on fire. Orange flames tore through the darkness, swallowing the old wood beam by beam. Sparks flew upward into the falling snow like a storm of burning stars. Elijah! Savannah stumbled toward the bedroom door barefoot, heart hammering so hard she could barely breathe. Downstairs, Rhett was already moving. The front door slammed open against the wind. Cold air burst through the house while he crossed the yard at a dead run. Coat half-buttoned, shotgun forgotten beside the porch rail. Elijah! Savannah screamed again. No answer came from the barn, only the roar of fire. The horses inside kicked wildly against their stalls. One shrill, terrified whinny cut through the night. Savannah grabbed a bucket near the pump, but the water inside had already frozen along the top. Her hands shook so badly she dropped it into the snow. Rhett reached the barn doors and tried pulling one open. It didn't move. His whole body went still for one terrible second, locked from the outside. Savannah saw it in his face then, not fear, memory. The same nightmare standing in front of him again. Rhett stepped back once and drove his shoulder hard against the wood. The chain snapped loose on the second hit. Smoke rolled outward thick and black into the snowstorm. Elijah! He shouted into the flames. A weak cough answered somewhere inside. Before Savannah could reach him, Rhett disappeared into the fire. The heat blasted outward, hard enough to sting her face even from the yard. Burning hay crackled overhead. One of the horses burst from the open doorway, wild-eyed and frantic, nearly knocking Savannah into the snow as it fled toward the pasture. Rhett! No answer, only fire. The barn roof groaned deep inside the smoke. Savannah's chest tightened so hard it hurt. Snow melted against her skin while she stood helpless in the freezing dark, watching the man she had slowly begun to love vanish into flames that already haunted him once before. Then she saw movement. Rhett emerged through the smoke, carrying Elijah across his shoulders. The boy coughed violently, arms hanging limp around Rhett's neck. Halfway through the doorway, a burning beam crashed down behind them with a shower of sparks. Savannah ran forward through the snow. Together they dragged Elijah clear of the barn, just as part of the roof collapsed inward with a thunderous crack. Elijah rolled onto his side, coughing hard, soot smeared across his face, but alive, alive. Savannah dropped to her knees beside him, grabbing his shoulders. "Look at me. Elijah, look at me." "I'm all right," he rasped between coughs, but she barely heard him. Her eyes had already lifted toward Rhett. He stood 10 feet away, swaying slightly in the snow. One sleeve had burned black near the wrist. Smoke curled from his coat. Blood ran down the side of his face where falling wood had struck him near the hairline. Still, he looked back at the burning barn instead of himself, like he expected it to take more from him. Something inside Savannah broke loose then. She crossed the snow in 3 fast steps and shoved both hands against his chest. "You don't get to die carrying ghosts." The words ripped out of her raw and shaking. Rhett stared at her. Snow melted against the dark stubble along his jaw. His breathing came rough from smoke and cold air. "You hear me?" Savannah shouted again, tears freezing against her cheeks. "You don't get to walk into fire every time the past comes calling." For a moment the only sound was the barn collapsing behind them. Then Rhett's shoulders sagged slightly. Not weakness, exhaustion. Like a man who had spent years holding up something too heavy alone. Sheriff Jonah Price arrived just before dawn with 2 deputies from town. By then, the fire had nearly burned itself out, leaving only smoking beams and drifting ash beneath the pale morning sky. Jonah crouched near the broken barn doors while snow settled softly across his old wool coat. Then his weathered face darkened. He rubbed 2 fingers along the wood near the latch and held them toward the lantern light. Lamp oil, fresh. This wasn't an accident, he muttered. Rhett stood silent beside the porch steps, one arm wrapped tightly around his ribs, while Clara Whitmore bandaged the cut along his forehead inside the kitchen doorway. Savannah watched Jonah carefully. The sheriff looked toward the blackened remains of the barn. Same smell as years ago, he said quietly. Rhett's jaw tightened. You saying somebody set this? Jonah rose slowly. I'm saying somebody wanted this place burning. The wind moved through Broken Ridge in long, low whistles. Savannah glanced toward Rhett. He wasn't looking at the fire anymore. He was staring toward the mountains beyond the ranch, toward cold mercy, as though he already knew exactly who had done it. That night, fever settled into him hard. Smoke in his lungs, burns across one arm, bruised ribs from falling timber. Savannah stayed beside the bed, changing cold cloths through the dark hours, while Elijah slept downstairs near the stove. The oil lamp burned low beside her elbow. Outside, snow drifted quietly over the ruined barn. Near midnight, Rhett stood beneath the blankets. His eyes opened halfway. For a moment he looked confused, seeing her there. Savannah reached for the water cup beside the bed. You need rest. But instead of taking the cup, Rhett caught her wrist weakly. His hand was hot with fever. Gray eyes met hers through the dim lantern light. And finally, after everything between them, the silence, the storms, the grief, he spoke the truth that had lived beneath it all. I should have asked you to stay for love, he whispered roughly. A pause. Not survival. Savannah's breath caught. Rhett's eyes closed again, almost immediately after. Fever pulling him back under before she could answer. But his hand never let go of hers. And for the first time since arriving at Broken Ridge Ranch, Savannah no longer felt like a woman hiding from winter. She felt like someone standing inside the fragile beginning of a home. Maybe that is why stories like this stay with us, long after the fire dies down and the snow finally melts from the mountains. Because somewhere in our lives, most of us have stood where Savannah stood, tired, guarded, carrying losses we rarely speak out loud, hoping for one quiet place in this world where we no longer have to survive every single day alone. And maybe some of us have been a little like Rhett too, trying to bury grief beneath work, beneath silence, beneath years that pass without warmth. But the truth is, a heart does not heal all at once. Sometimes it happens slowly, in the sound of another cup set beside yours at the table, in someone waiting for you to come home before the coffee gets cold, in a hand that still reaches for yours after the worst night of your life. That is what Broken Ridge became in the end. Not a perfect place, just a place where wounded people finally stopped carrying their winters alone. If this story reminded you of someone you once loved or someone you lost, I'd truly like to hear about them in the comments. And if you'd like, stay a little longer on this trail with me. There are still more quiet towns, lonely ranches, forgotten people, and heartfelt stories waiting just beyond the next mountain.